Hello and welcome. I am Kim Keen, host of the One of a Kind You podcast. I started this podcast to share my journey of my past self, a woman who was struggling with leaving her teaching career and adjusting to stay-at-home mom life, to help other women with their motherhood journeys or their work-life balance journeys so they can let go and make themselves a priority without all the sacrificing. If you are a regular listener to One of a Kind You, thank you so much for tuning into another episode. I'm so excited that you're here. And if you are new, thank you so much for stopping by to check it out and see what it's all about. And the way that this podcast usually works for my new listeners is that I read a journal entry of mine from about 5 or 6 years ago, and I reflect on what I know now as a certified life coach, on what I wish I knew then in the thick of the struggle. But today I have an amazing guest on. She is an inspirational young woman. Her name is Nidhi, and she is a fellow podcaster. And she's not a typical guest because she's 17, which is amazing that at 17 she's starting her own podcast, and her podcast is called You're Heard. But a fellow podcasting friend of ours, who was actually a past guest on One of a Kind You, reached out and said, Kim, you have to have Nidhi on your podcast because she has such an important message to share with the moms that tune in. So I said, yeah, let's make it happen. So here we are today. Welcome, Nidhi. Thank you so much for being on One of a Kind You. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Kim. I'm so excited to be on here, and I'm so glad I'm able to receive this platform to share my ideas, and especially with someone like you, who's, again, very inspirational likewise.
Oh, thank you. So, Nidhi, tell us, how did you decide to start a podcast while you're still working to finish high school?
I think because I was I came up with this idea about a year ago, and I was sitting at home and I was researching myself about mental health conditions because, again, this was something I was very, very interested in as a kid. I was someone who was super into psychoanalyzing people around me and trying to understand the people around me. I think it was maybe a coping mechanism that I developed because of things that happened within my family and experiences that I had had. I adapted myself towards like a therapist-esque persona where I was like listening to the people around me and trying to digest what I'm taking in. And so last year I was more interested in actual diagnosis and mental health when I was like trying to understand myself. Um, I was going through depression, and I finally understood that I actually had a mental health disorder that needed to be taken care of. And I realized that, you develop your own sort of ideas and stigmas about these issues, but then when you actually learn about them, you see that there's a lot of like overlapping, and then there's a lot of oversimplification of symptoms that occurs, like especially with our generation.
Mm-hmm.
So I started my podcast to be able to like talk about these mental health conditions individually and spread awareness in a very sort of direct way where I list out, okay, so this is what happens. And then these could be symptoms. These are how some professionals like to advise. And I have like professionals on who sort of just advise and not advise, but talk about like the chemical backgrounds and things like that of disorders so that it steers us away from the whole stereotyping, and people who actually have these disorders and are diagnosed with these disorders, they have a voice. They have someone who is able to tell them, okay, so this is how things could be for you, and we hear you, this is how you might be feeling. And that way, like, they don't feel as alone. And like being diagnosed with a disorder can be extremely isolating. So I feel like having people knowing more about disorders in general is super important to feel more included and understood in the community. So
Yeah.
that was one of the reasons why I decided to start the podcast.
Yes, I love it. And I have to tell you, um, I also, from a very young age, was always interested in why do people do what they do, to the point where I was a latchkey kid, and that meant that I brought myself home after school. So I rode the school bus home, and then I had my own house key, and I let myself in, and it was my job to get my snack and my homework started until my parents got home from work. And so before, getting started on homework and things, I would always put a show on called Cops, which was like the first reality TV show in America, where you basically, it was like a ride along with a police officer. And I was always fascinated about, why were people getting in trouble with the police? And then that bridged into like watching documentaries on cults and serial killers. And so 8, 9, 10 years old, I've always also been fascinated with the psychology around human behavior and why do people do what they do. And maybe like you, it was a coping mechanism to help me understand things that I was experiencing in my childhood. So I think it's fascinating that you also have that same interest. And I still am infatuated. I still love watching crime shows and different documentaries around cults and serial killers and true crime and things like that. But um, I also appreciate you sharing openly that you were battling with depression and what that journey was like for you. Um, and that's the one thing I wanted to say that I didn't say in the introduction is that we're having a real open, raw conversation, and you're going to share things that might be triggering because there was this a peer of yours that you were sharing with me before we actually hit the record button, and some of the things that we were discussing can be triggering for some people, especially parents, if they have a child who's experiencing the same thing or could possibly be experiencing the same thing. So just to give everybody the fair warning that there are going to be things that we talk about today that could be triggering in terms of mental health problems, and that includes self-harming and things like that. So just listen with caution. And if any time you feel triggered, not our intention, but just really helping to create a more open dialogue around these topics so that there's more acceptance, awareness, inclusion, but also support too, because I think that's super important. Because usually when we're going through something like that, it often does feel isolating, like you said. And I was struggling with my own mental health situation when I left my teaching career. Hence the reason I started this podcast, because that time was such a lonely time. Because no one knew that I was struggling. I didn't share it with anyone. I didn't want anyone to know because I felt like a failure, and I felt like people would look at me in a not so great way if they knew that the struggle that I was going through was as bad as it was.
Yeah.
So, so you were battling with depression, and I'm sure in high school that did that stem from the pressure of getting good grades and participating in activities, or what do you think was the cause of it? And do you see that same pressure or the same situation with your friends and them navigating the same struggle that you were navigating?
Um, Actually, no, for me, I think it's a bit different. So,
Hmm.
obviously, with other friends that I've seen going through symptoms of depression, there are overlapping, symptoms, and you see overlapping behavior. But then I think my cause is different because I went through some forms of childhood trauma, like losing really close family members and things, and seeing things that probably children shouldn't have been seeing between the ages of like 6 to say 13.
Hmm.
And I think something that's like for me, I believe that my depression stemmed from the chemical changes that occurred. So during my developmental stages, right, like between 6 and 13, you're growing so much. And um, because I was going through so much change, I think my emotions were really disrupted and they were out of normal range. And so my serotonin levels were probably really low. And that's something my brain probably adapted to. So for
Hmm.
me, depression was something I seemed to be like stuck in. It was
Hmm.
something that I thought, I tried to change things around me, but it didn't really work. So obviously in high school, that affects you a lot, with
Yeah.
changing friendships, changing behavior that you see in yourself. Especially, I think one of the biggest things with teenagers going through disorders or like issues is that we pick apart our own behavior, we
Hmm.
analyze it so deeply that it eats at us. We hyperfixate on things, we tend to like overthink things, we may even do what's called curve fitting, where we see one thing and then we're like, oh, what if we have this, what if we have this? But then really it's just one symptom of an emotion or like one disorder, whereas we think, okay, I'm feeling restless, I have da 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 da. That's
Mhm.
probably also because of the internet, social media. We
Yes.
constantly get told, okay, you have ABC, you have depression. And so again, the curve fitting thing, you tend to hyperfixate and eat yourself up, telling yourself, you have so many different issues. And then it's depressing. It affects your, ability to have friendships, your changing friendships, relationships, even pressures in school. You're like, I'm not able to focus, maybe there's something wrong with me. And
Mhm.
I think that's just how we've been conditioned to think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to speak from an adult perspective, but as adults, when we're having the same struggles, we do the same things. It's not just a teenage thing. We do the same thing because we also have those same pressures from social media, especially as moms, because we have the pressure from social media to look like the perfect mom, but we also have the pressure from social media to have the perfect kids. So
um,
while our kids are affected from the pressure of social media to show up in this perfect way, we also have that same pressure. And so without realizing that the other is going through the same exact thing.
yeah. No, exactly. So, like, social media is like, there's so many good things about social
Mhm.
media, but then it also comes about like with its drawbacks. Like on social media, awareness can go two different ways. There's awareness about mental health issues, like what we're doing,
Mhm.
podcasting, we're spreading awareness about issues. And we don't do it in a way to say, okay, you have this is your problem, this is your solution. We do it in a way to sort of understand and like help. But then on social media, you have the other kind of awareness where it's like, harm, like it's not with the intention of harming, but it can go in that direction, right? So
Yeah.
like on TikTok, for example, like I'm not gonna lie and say I don't use TikTok or TikTok's bad, because TikTok's part of my daily routine. But then there's like things on TikTok where you'll see people saying, okay, there's all of this, and you need to fit into this ideal like criteria to be considered something else. And then
Mhm.
everyone wants to be something else, or like it's super confusing. Like you can go from talking just about mental health disorders to body image and things like that. So I think we are constantly being told what we need to be and
Yes.
what we are, which is like, I mean, it's not just pertaining to teenagers, it's adults as well. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
totally agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I've just started dipping my toe into TikTok, and it feels so awkward and so uncomfortable to be there because I'm not dancing. Like I absolutely refuse to dance on TikTok. But it's that same thing where it's like sometimes I get hooked in the fact that I'm like, oh my gosh, this video only got 200 views, and I thought it was going to get way more than that because I did the same reel on Instagram and it got 9,000 views, but it only got 200 on TikTok. And so it is totally messes with your mind. So it's all about putting boundaries in place with social media and remembering the reason for being on there. Is it fun? Is it a way to connect? But I agree, there are so many great things about social media. I mean, for instance, I'm in Pennsylvania and you're in Singapore. So without social media, without the connection of podcasting and Instagram, you and I would not be having this conversation right now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's
So
the beauty.
exactly. I
Is
mean, sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, it takes away the global barriers. So like we now it's 11 o'clock at night your time, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, she should be in bed. That's the moment I'm like, oh my god, she should be in bed, not talking to me on the podcast. But here I am across the Atlantic Ocean, and we're able to have a conversation. So I just think that's incredible. So that's a huge gift in social media.
Definitely. Like, I think we've been gifted with an abundance of resources and knowledge, which could go both ways. But I mean, being able to connect with you like this is mind blowing. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you put it into perspective, especially with the pandemic. Like,
Yes. Yeah, and I think even though the pandemic has been so restrictive, I think on some level it's been so opening too, because I feel like with the pandemic, I've been able to connect more with people in Europe and overseas that I wouldn't have necessarily had the opportunity to connect with if we didn't have the pandemic. So there's another silver lining. But I know with the pandemic, that's also been a huge source of um, mental health. Like that's been a huge, I'll say, agitator for mental health issues. And I can't imagine what that's been like for teenagers, because you're used to being in school and having that connection with your friends at school. And then that was taken away for some time and then changed with virtual learning and all of that. So, how has that been with trying to keep a sense of normalcy in life when you've gone from being in school with all of your friends to not having that connection?
Um, I think like in terms of school, I think it's very different for different people. Like
Hmm.
for me in particular, um, being there in person, while it's, very entertaining, it's very, engaging, we're able to actually have better discussions in person. Um, I struggle with focusing. So like it's not that I get distracted, but I might like zone out or something. And that translated online and made it like a lot worse, because
Hmm.
I'd be like on a desk just staring at a computer screen for like 6 hours. And obviously I'd have my breaks, but then like it's very, very hard to be able to adjust to that kind of mindset, to adjust that to that kind of routine where you're just staring in one position. It's completely out of the ordinary. I don't think it's anything any of like normal people would be used to.
Yeah.
People who work like 9 to 5 jobs and like a company, or say someone who travels a lot, like going down and being put into a routine that's not your own.
Hmm.
It's so like it can confuse you, can be so draining as well. One thing like that came out of the pandemic, that not came out, but like I realized from the pandemic, is like people don't talk about this enough, but it's something that affected me. It affected a lot of my friends as well. Like you'll have so many new insecurities that you didn't realize that you had earlier, like because earlier you'd meet more people in person. If you were talking to someone, you'd probably meet them in person at some point, or like if you're getting close to someone, you would have seen them in real life, you would have hung out with them or something like along the lines. Whereas when we got into the pandemic, we're so used to just meeting people online. I became super aware of my online presence. I felt the need to post, or I felt the need to constantly be on social media, and not validating myself, but like constantly posting myself, or like trying to understand how, or help people that I didn't know who I was, or um, just my online presence. Like house parties started and like everyone's video calling. And then when you meet those people in real life, suddenly there's all these like there's this pressure and like stress or nervousness that you feel that you may not have felt earlier, like post pre-pandemic. Like I
Hmm.
was so much more nervous about meeting people in real life than I would have been before. I think like a lot of people came out of the pandemic with like social anxiety and like a lot of new insecurities, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's stayed like throughout. So even now, I'm super conscious about posting on social media. I don't post much anymore because I'm so scared of the difference with me behind the scenes and in online. I think that's something a lot of people struggled with getting out of as we move on to like, post COVID sort of. Now, obviously we're not in post COVID, but we're living with COVID now. People are
Yeah.
so down, and like in most places you see people a lot. So I think that adjustment's also really, really scary in a sense.
Yeah, so it's like the fear of like, okay, I've been showing up on social media and now am I going to measure up the same way in person that I was on this, the way that people see me on a device. And it's interesting that you say that because my 12-year-old does not have social media. She has a cell phone, but it's like an older, it's like the bare bones phone. It's like it's not an Apple phone. It's like a Samsung or something. I don't know. And but she doesn't have social media. So she doesn't have Instagram. She doesn't have TikTok. She doesn't have any of it. No Snapchatting. And she doesn't want it. She's like, I don't want it. Which I'm like, thank goodness. Let's not tackle social media until we absolutely have to. But for the pandemic, for the 2020-21 school year. So when she was in fifth grade, she just finished sixth, but when she was in fifth grade, she did that whole school year virtually. And Lily is so social. She's so outgoing. She very much is a person who thrives on human interaction and social connection face to face. And so for her, it was a struggle to be basically behind a computer screen. And she would say things like, when I go back to school in person in the fall, to start sixth grade, no one's even going to know who I am because there's so many new kids at school. And she's like, it's almost like I'm disappearing from school. So she felt like she was going to have to start over again with making friends and adjusting to the new people at school, which is really ironic because she's been at the same school since she was in pre-K3. And so almost 10 years she's been at the same school. And the amount of new kids and that start there, it's very minimal. But in her mind, she had created it to be this big thing because she hadn't been there in person for a whole school year. And when the school year started in the fall and she went in person, she did fine. She adjusted. Everybody remembered who she was. But she had that moment where she thought, oh my gosh, I'm vanishing and no one knows that I exist anymore. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's like awful for someone to feel that way. So and then to add social media on top of it, I just can't even imagine um the mental struggle that's there, the emotional struggle, the social struggle. It's a lot. And I think sometimes as parents we don't get it because we didn't grow up with social media. So social media didn't become a thing until I was in my mid 20s, so maybe early 20s, but it really wasn't a big thing growing up because in high school I had a pager because cell phones weren't even a thing. Like to have a phone that connected to the internet, like literally your cell phone just was used for calling people and talking on the phone like a regular phone. So I think sometimes as parents it's hard for us to tap into those struggles because it's not the same struggle that we had growing up. So we don't get it. And then we think like, oh, you're just being dramatic. Oh, you're being sensitive. Oh, get over it. Like, you're fine. And so I'm sure I know that's not a serving way. So what do you think, like, are there warning signs that we can look for as parents, like to be like, oh my gosh, you're struggling with social anxiety, or oh my gosh, I think you're struggling with depression or anxiety. Um, like, what do you want us moms to know, Nidhi, so that we can be more helpful?
I think definitely one of the things that you would notice as a mother, like, seeing your kid at home most of the time, I guess, like in that situation, you'd notice like there's definitely isolation that can
Mm-hmm.
occur. You'll see that they're distancing themselves. You see a lot of the time it gets passed off as, oh my God, she's just on her phone all the time, or they are just on their phone all the time. And it's just an attitude problem or something like that. But then, when you really look at it, it could just be them trying to be by themselves because they don't want to have that company, or they're not comfortable enough in that company, or just outside of their little like shell,
Mm-hmm.
and so isolating is a thing. I noticed, like, in a lot of people that I've been around, and me as well, like the changing of appearance is also a huge thing. So you'll see that maybe they're tapping into like doing their hair differently, or like doing their makeup differently, or like getting into makeup, or being super conscious about how they look, things like that. If you see new insecurities being developed, maybe you could think about it as, they're definitely going through some self-doubt, or it could also be them just exploring themselves and like seeing what works for them, what doesn't. But I think having that conversation with them about, how they see themselves, or whether they're feeling insecure, is definitely something that's important. Like having a conversation with my mom about how I'm feeling about myself on a certain day really helps me and helps her understand what kind of struggles I'm going through, right?
Yeah.
So
So
this
does your mom start the conversation with you and you're open to talking, or do you go to your mom and say like, I'm really struggling, can I talk to you?
um my mom in particular, like we've very recently gotten a very, very good relationship, like a tight knit sort of relationship. And um so now I feel like I can talk to her about anything. And I think she sees it. Like if I'm feeling insecure, I'll be like, oh my God, I feel so ugly right now. Or like I'll just say it, I'll be able to
Mhm.
say it. And um yeah, it's like a pretty transparent conversation. But then I get that a lot of people don't have that kind of closeness with their parents, which it used to be like that. Like I don't think I'd be able to just openly say that. But I definitely did have a huge transition recently.
Mhm.
And but I feel like um if you're a mother that's not super close with your kid and you want to have that conversation about, body positivity or like body confidence, self-confidence, or just like a conversation about their mental health, I think just, people usually go into a particular dialogue where you'll be like, oh, you can talk to me about anything. That's what you always hear, but that's not, you know, we're so used to hearing that. Everyone says that now. You go anywhere,
Mhm.
you're feeling tired. Someone will be like, oh, are you okay? You can talk to me about anything. It's like something we're so used to hearing. So obviously at some point that's going to stop working, you
Yeah.
know? And like I think we're all trying to figure that out.
Yes.
But as a mother, I understand that it could be like super stressful, like not being able to like instigate that conversation.
Yes.
So sorry, initiate that conversation. I think maybe sitting down with them and like connecting on a particular topic that
Mhm.
maybe the child feels like passionate about, or like you can lead it into something that she's very interested in, so that you're already in an engaging conversation, and then taking it somewhere. So if I'm like talking to my mom about something, like it could be anything, maybe even a sport that I'm super interested in, and then from that depth of a conversation we take it to another conversation. That translation, it rarely you would feel like, oh my God, wait, what's going on? You wouldn't
Mhm.
just suddenly detach yourself from the conversation. Like if you have like a transition into another conversation, I think that's something that would really help you get something out, or like be able to establish that relationship in that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I love that idea. And one thing that my daughter and I did when she was a little bit younger, when it was like time to start having the conversation about body changing from puberty and things like that, she didn't. I was like, do you want to talk about it? And she was like, nope. I don't want to have that conversation with you. And she was like, I'll just write you a note if I have any questions. So I said, okay, that's fine. And so I ordered her a special journal, and so I let her pick the journal out. And then that was how we had the conversation about any questions she had, because she read the American Girl doll book about, it's called My Body, I think. And so that was how we navigated that time, was through writing in a journal, because I think for there, that was easier for her to get her thoughts and her questions out on a piece of paper and not have to look me in the face, and then get the answer. And then she could process the answer that I had given her. And then if she had more questions, so it gave her time to really think through what she wanted to say, but it also gave her time to think through my response. So then she could decide if she had any additional questions or wanted to comment or anything like that, without the pressure of me sitting there looking at her like, so Lily, do you have any questions? Is there something you want to talk about?
I have a question about that. Like,
Yeah.
you just pretend that wasn't happening in real life. So like when you're going about your day, you just put the note somewhere and then just pretend it wasn't happening.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I
So
think that would go really well.
Yeah, so she would typically either slide the journal under my bedroom door, or she would leave it right outside of her bedroom door, or she would put it on the table next to my bed. And then I would write back and I would slide it under her door, or I would leave it on her bedside table or even on her desk. And then so it was there. So it was also not something that she had to look at right away, even though I think she did. Like as soon as she saw that it was there, she went over and she read it right away. So it was there, but it wasn't like had to be addressed immediately. So it gave her an opportunity to address it in her own time. And so that worked. And then, she got all the answers she needed to know. And then the journal went back into the drawer, and we haven't used it in a while. But I'm sure it will come back out again, because now we're, at the point where we're talking about having crushes on boys and things like that. So she'll be mortified to know that I just said that on this podcast, because of course that would be embarrassing for her, because right now all she says is that I'm cringe. And she's like, "You're so cringy. You're being so cringe right now." And I'm like, "I'm not. I'm a cool mom. Come on, Lily." And she's like, "No, cringe." I was like, "Thanks. I try really hard to be a cool mom, unlike my own parents. I'm working really hard at this, Lily. Cut me some slack, sister." But she's just at that age. So I sometimes it hurts my feelings, and I just, process through it on my own, and I understand, where she's coming from, because I felt the same way about my own parents. But then sometimes I think she's just doing it to get a rise out of me, to see what I'm going to do. But I didn't know, Nidhi, if you wanted to talk at all about what you and I were talking about before we hit record, with the things that you've experienced with classmates at school, or if you don't want to talk about that.
I mean, I'm open to talking about it, but then I do want to like respect her privacy and things
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that. So
yes. So
talk about
not
it.
specifics, just in general.
Mhm.
Like what was, I guess, learned from that situation for you, with your own friends, or um, the takeaway, like, so that way, as parents, we know, because I don't think so. What we're talking about is suicide. And so I think it's a more common problem than we realize. And I don't think that we always see the signs. And so, looking back, and just the gist of it was that there was a situation with a suicide at Nidhi's school. And so, Nidhi, like looking back, was there something, like, what was the biggest thing that you gained in regards to insight from having this situation happen?
Um, so definitely what I noticed was the different coping mechanisms that were
Mm-hmm.
there. So it was so sudden. So we went to school one morning, and then at home base so home base is basically like the 10 minutes that you get before all of your lessons start. And
We
so
call that
that's
homeroom.
okay, homeroom, right? So yeah, so we were just told on that we were just told I think it was an email, and the teacher read it out, and they were like, okay, so we're so sad to inform you that this happened. And if you need anything, you can come down to the welfare center or the office. And like obviously everyone was like shocked, everyone, like you could hear like whispers going around, and me especially, I was just baffled.
Yeah.
I could have never seen that coming on that morning, just coming into class and hearing that someone that I was tutoring like a few months ago committed suicide. Like it was the least expected thing, because you hear about it. There are people around you who feel like doing it, and like you may have distant people who've done it, or you may have yourself felt tendencies, but then when you see that someone's actually done it, it puts things into like huge perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so sorry, 1 second.
Oh, that's okay.
I'm just getting my charger. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it put things into like perspective for me. Not just the whole thing of someone committing, but also like the response that it was getting. So
Yeah.
I reacted. I'm somewhat sensitive, so especially to death and loss. So for me, I was in shock. I was emotional throughout the day. I wasn't able to like focus at all, and then I'd see people just going about their day, people who knew her, and I was so confused because I thought this was going to be monumental. I thought this was going to be something that really shocked us all, as it did me. People stopped talking about it so fast, and we had an event the next day that, like, it was like a dress up day or something, and I expected it to like be canceled or something in honor of her, something along the lines, but nothing happened. We just went on with it, and but the teachers were obviously like, with respect to her, this and that, but like coping with that difference, like knowing it was always in the back of my mind, right?
Yeah.
And when you talk about like the things I learned from the experience itself, is like, you never know. You think you know everything, you think you're so aware of what's happening with the people around you. You think you're super aware about, the general state of the people around you. And then something like this happens and it really shocks you, which is why I can imagine how hard it would have been for people who were like even closer to her than I was.
Mm-hmm.
I tutored her maybe like twice, and it took me so far with my emotions.
Yeah.
And people who were actually friends with her, I can't even imagine what kind of reflection they would have been going through. So as a parent, like, if you're wondering, as a parent, like, I can imagine how stressful it would be, being in the dark about something like this, not being sure, should I be worried about whether or not my child is facing these like these issues and stuff. Like, it can be extremely scary because
Yeah.
you
And
never.
you never know. And mental health, I feel like, I don't know about the state of Singapore, but I feel like America, we are in a mental health crisis. And I feel like there are not enough facilities, beds available in facilities for people to go get the help that they need. So they suffer alone in silence, and feel hopeless about it, and feel like there's no hope, no hope, no help, no resources, no nothing. And so I feel like, they resort to that. And there are adults that I know who have had, who've experienced suicide in their families, with other adult members, and that's, awful to go through. So to have it happen to someone who's so much younger, I just can't even imagine the impact. But one of the other things that you wanted to share was that, and I think this is so important, and I kind of alluded to this, is that I think sometimes we see people and they're struggling and we dismiss them as being dramatic, or um, overreacting, or being super sensitive, or just needing to get a grip. And we minimize what's really happening and what's really taking place. And I think because we minimize it, we kind of cut ourselves off to actually noticing the true warning signs and the things that are really taking place. And it might be a coping mechanism for us because we're not really sure how to help or what to do to move forward. But I think when we do make those comments like, oh, stop being so dramatic, or, oh, stop being so sensitive, it implies this lack of resiliency. It implies that they're not capable of overcoming things. It implies that there's some sort of weakness. And do you see that too, or do you feel that? And do the kids that you go to school with feel that?
um I think definitely there's like that stigma that our generation, because we have all this awareness, we have an abundance of awareness, we have so much understanding, like understanding as in, we like, we hear the terms being thrown around a lot, and so it's something that's always there, like mental health has become one of the most talked about things. And so there's this general stigma that people who talk about their mental health, or like um talk about what they're going through, especially, there's like the generation difference. Usually it's people of older generations saying this about our generation, where like they consider us weak, because we're, you know, something that may have affected them when they were at, in your generation, something that affected you, maybe it has a bigger effect on us. And we are super sensitive to that is just how you guys see it, right? But I think what the real difference is that, you know, back then you would know your circle, you know, your small circle, you had that knowledge of the people around you. But, you know, we have tens of thousands of people we learn about like almost every month. You know, we just keep finding new people, you know, even if it's just going through your feed on Instagram or TikTok and you just see one person, you automatically know that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like you can so quickly get their story. Whereas in back in the day, like for you guys, I'm assuming, like you would just know about the people around you. So, and most of the time, those people wouldn't be able to say what they were going through. You know, it wasn't so accepted because you didn't know that other people were going through the same thing. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't know so many people were going through the same thing. So you didn't have that sort of society where you were able to talk about what you were going through and
Yeah.
feeling accepted, feeling normal. But then for us, it's more normalized, which is good. You know, we're working towards normalizing mental health disorders and mental health conditions. So we find it a lot easier to talk about it, which I get, you know, like there's a difference between how much it was talked about back then and how much it's talked about now. But in a way, that's good. It's good that we're talking about it now because people feel more included. We feel more safe within the people around us. You can easily turn to someone and say, hey, I'm feeling kind of anxious. Can we go sit somewhere else? Or like, can you come with me to the bathroom so I can cool down? Maybe I'm about to have a panic attack. I need a break, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to say those things now than it would have been back then. People would have just looked at you like you were crazy, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that's very different to what it is now. Whereas like there's also the difference, you know, if I tell my like if someone tells their parent that they're feeling a certain way and then they say to their parent that their friend's feeling a certain way, there's a very different response, you know, like the parent might see the friend as like, oh my god, what's going on, like why is she like that? But then
Mm-hmm.
when it's your own kid, you see it differently. I think there's
Yeah.
just that stigmatism that needs to be like broken down a bit more because you really only understand when it's your own, and
Mm-hmm.
then you start to apply it further, you know, outside that circle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And yes, so I was born in 1982. So growing up, we had telephones with a that hung on the wall with a cord, so you could only go as far from the telephone as the cord would allow you to. And then it was like amazing when we got a cordless phone because then we could walk around the whole house and talk on the phone. Like what? Mind blowing. But then cell phones started off in a black like leather pouch, and you never could get cell reception, and they were really only good for like if you got a flat tire and you needed to call like roadside assistance or something. So it's crazy, like for me, being born in 1982 to where we are now with technology in terms of the ability to communicate. So email wasn't a thing, you know, so it was like you could talk to your friends in your neighborhood, you talk to the people that you knew at school, and you talk to your family that like lived in your immediate house, but like you only saw people outside of that circle if it was like a family function. So like some people we only saw at Christmas or at Thanksgiving, and we didn't have a lot of contact with them. And so like we still sent letters through the mail, like putting a stamp on them. And so then when email came along, that was earth shattering because like wow, there was that sense of instant communication. And then social media has just turned that on its head, and smartphones. And so I think now there's definitely more awareness and there's more ways to connect. But I think there's that feeling, and if someone isn't telling us that we're weak for having the mental health struggles that we're having, I think on some level we tell ourselves we're weak because we see other people on social media and they look like they've got it figured out. And then we feel like we don't because we're doing that whole comparison thing. And so it's interesting because there was just scrolling through TikTok, I saw this TikTok of this woman who was sobbing and basically shared how she was married to her best friend, but was miserable and was miserable at work. So, anyways, long story short, she left the marriage. She decided, or she came out of the closet. She was like, decided that she wanted to still be friends with the ex-husband, but wanted to be in a relationship with a woman, left her career, and now is traveling the country in an RV. And for her, that seemed to take all of her problems away. But then not everybody has the ability to just quit everything in life and go live in an RV and drive all over the country. So then you see like almost like this glamorized lifestyle of like, oh my God, I was miserable in life. So I just left everything. I got an RV and now I drive around the world and I see these beautiful sights. So now life is good. So it's like, it makes it feel like, oh my gosh, well, my life could never be good because don't have the opportunity to go driving around the country in an RV by myself, living it up. So I feel like there's kind of like that pressure there to also get it figured out to make the pain stop. And then when you can't do that and you're still stuck in that spiral of it all, it perpetuates that feeling of weakness. Like, well, why can't I figure it out? Why can't I make the change? Why can't things be better for me? And so I think it goes back to what you said, Nidhi, earlier about social media, is that the more we're on social media, we start looking outside of ourselves for the answers.
Yeah.
Instead of tapping in to because we all have the answers within us and what's right for us and what's good for us. But I think we lose sight of that because we have it's like information overload and human connection overload. So it's really easy to get lost in it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. Like, it's so easy to, there's like, I think that I just call this stepping back. Like, you sometimes you get lost in this other sort of reality where it's like, what happens around you. And like, I don't know, I realized this very recently, like when I actually step back and look at myself and look at the life that I'm living, I realize that it's a lot different to what I project, or a lot different to what sometimes I get so, clouded by.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the answers can be so simple, but then we like overcomplicate things so fast. Like, things like, you know, like I was talking to a friend recently, and this was like general like relationship talk, right? Um so like we have some friends who, struggle to leave a relationship, right? And they're not sure whether they're going to be okay without a relationship and things like that. And like when I looked back and I like thought about it, like if you're like, when you're able to leave a relationship and if you're worried about how you're going to be without the person, I think the problem is that you don't see yourself without that person there. You don't see yourself as whole without that person there. And I think with us, we're so quick to glamorize the idea of being in a relationship. We so fast, we're like, we get asked all the time, oh, are you dating somebody?
Mm-hmm.
It's like an expectation to be in a relationship. Like, we get so lost in the idea that our sole purpose in this time, like apart from studies, is to find a guy, like find a relationship, have like that side life going on. And it's not like that. Like, when you look at it, really, it is a choice. It's so easy to just make that choice. You're not different for not having a relationship. You're not different for wanting to be independent. But
Mm-hmm.
like, when people like you even like you see the prettiest people and you're like, oh, do you have a relationship? And they're like, no. And then you hear, what, why not? You're so pretty. So it's like this automatic, with social media, with the way that our generation's changing, and like ideals are changing, adults are also understanding kids better and things. You have this pressure to fit into one sort of body, the one sort of idealistic life.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I think what it really narrows down to is just doing what you want, doing what's good for you. But people so easily lose track of that. Like, I know that I lost track of that a while back. Like, I was doing things just for the sake of doing them because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. But then recently I took a step back where I changed so many things in my life. And I found how simple life can really be. Like, I had a bunch of like loose ends, like friendships and things that weren't benefiting me. There was drama, but I felt this like constant need to like fix things and like keep that relationship there, forgive and things like that. Like, I'm not saying forgiveness is bad, but I'm saying like there is that time where you can draw the line, but I think we forget that. We
Yeah.
so easily forget that we have choices, and we really need to put ourselves first, which is what I think everyone, like not just kids, I think everyone's losing sight of that really it is our life and we need to put ourselves first. And I think that's the first step to, really taking care of your mental health, is realizing what your own boundaries are, what you want, and what's going to help you. And like when it's so easy to just say it, and it's so easy to just say, okay, yeah, choose what's right, choose what's wrong, and like cut it off. It's obviously a lot harder than that, but really it narrows down to what you think's good for you, which is
Yeah.
what, like, it was like a mind-blowing like revolutionary thing for me that I realized. And it's all I ever talk about. Like, you'll hear me talking to my mom about it, like in the balcony every other day. I'll just be like, oh my god, mom, I'm so happy I realized this.
Yes.
Yeah,
And I think it's amazing that you've realized it at such a young age, because that's going to save you so much struggle and stress and pain and heartache and frustration as you continue to finish high school and go to university and have relationships. And I just think, like, wow. So, Nidhi, you are such a wise person for just being 17. And not to minimize 17, I mean, you've had life experience, but a lot of people, I will say, who have reached 30s, 40s, 50s, have not achieved that insight that you've achieved at your age. So I think that's amazing. And I think you are absolutely right. The place to start is putting yourself first. And you're right, it's not easy to do that. And so it's like just starting small with one thing. And it can be, the example I give is, this is such a silly example, but it's like even just picking the toothpaste that you like it can be something that simple, to start for prioritizing yourself, because if you can start with the small things, then you can take it to the bigger things. So
exactly.
is there anything else that we could chat forever and ever, but I'm like trying to be mindful of time. I'm like, okay, it's midnight, you've got to get to bed. So because I don't know what you have in store for tomorrow, but is there anything else that you would like to share with us before we wrap up?
I mean, like adding on to what you just said, right? The whole thing about putting yourself first, as daunting, like this was again a conversation I was having recently with a friend. As daunting as it seems, it's a chain reaction. It's like a mindset that you subconsciously get sucked into once you start. Like, because of how rewarding it is, when you put yourself first for the first time, or like consciously putting yourself first and receiving the fruits of that, you feel how good it is, right? So it's that reward that makes you realize that you can do it more and more and more. So I think, like, to anyone that's afraid of putting themselves first, start small, like you said. Start small, feel how good it is, and continue. Obviously, may not always go the right way, but it's just about being mindful and like making that conscious decision and feeling the reward of it. Even if you feel bad for doing a certain thing, you really need to put it into perspective. That's something, like, I think we lose track of with social media, with just the ideals that keep getting projected onto us. Like, we lose track of what life and reality really is just a step back and looking at things from your own perspective and how your life is revolving around you. So yeah, that's basically all that I have to say. I
Well,
hope I answered your questions all right.
yes. Oh my gosh, you did amazing. And so a couple times I was like, oh, I hope I didn't put too much pressure on her to make her feel like she has to come up with the right answer. But no, everything has been great. And I think this is going to be so helpful because um, it's always helpful for us to hear the perspective of someone else. And I think from a mom, it's super perspective to hear. It's super helpful to hear the perspective of a young woman, because you're not that much farther along in the journey than my daughter. You're 4 years older. But I can see where there are similarities between what you're experiencing at 17 and what she's experiencing at 12, almost 13. And so it gives me things to look out for and to keep in mind as I'm trying to help her navigate things through her teenage years and high school and college and things like that. So it's been super helpful. And I'm sure that the other moms who are listening would say the same thing. And we will put the link to your podcast in the show notes so that anyone who wants to take a listen can go right there. And then also like any social media that you would like us to follow you on, we would be happy to do that. So I'm also following Nidhi on Instagram for her podcast account. And we'll put the link for that there as well. And Nidhi, I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and share your insights and your awareness and your experience and your knowledge. It's been incredible. And if there's ever a time where you feel like you want to come on again and share other things that you've learned or knowledge that you've gained or experiences that you've had that you think will be helpful for us to listen to, I would love to have you back. So just know that the invitation is there.
Thank you so much again for having me as
Yeah.
well. All of your kind words and wisdom. Like, it really means a lot. So thank you.
Awesome. You're welcome. So we'll keep in touch, Nidhi. And if you found this episode helpful, please feel free to share it with a friend. The more, the merrier. And also, if you found this episode helpful, please feel free to leave a review. I take the time to read all the reviews to ensure that the feedback that you provide, I take that, I use it to continually improve this podcast. So it's a space where you feel supported and safe, but also a place of guidance, a resource, because let's face it, us moms and us women, we have to stick together. So thank you so much for tuning into another episode of One of a Kind You, and I will see you next week.